Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. And we are finished with our old GCSE unit, so we are starting fresh today on our new unit, which is called America 1920 to 1973, Opportunity and Inequality. Right, so we focus on this entire time period when loads of really interesting things happen. We look at the boom, the beginning of adverts, the creation of the mass production of fridges and TVs, what happened with the Wall Street crash, who suffered, how did the country recover from that, all the doom and gloom there, how different presidents tried to solve America's problems, through to the African American civil rights movement alongside Black Power and the feminist movement. It's really, really interesting, and there is so much we're going to cover. So stay tuned and we'll see what we're going to do today. Right, so today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rush through some of the basic facts about America in terms of the way they're governed, but most importantly, it's going to be a whistle-stop tour of American history. Now, before we start, I've got a very fun fact. The American flag was actually designed by a 17-year-old student called Robert Heft, and his teacher at school only gave him a B- for it, but then they upgraded the result to an A when it was adopted by by Congress. So that's funny, isn't it? If you think you can't achieve anything, well, look, a 17-year-old made a flag, which is now the flag of the United States of America. Okay, so the American story obviously begins with Native Americans or Native Indians who lived in America originally, for almost the entirety of time, and they lived in tribes across America for thousands of years before white men went over and settled. It's so important that we recognize that. Now, I guess America, as it becomes, with kind of all the stereotypical things that we know of settlement in America, that process begins from 1565 with the very first European settlement in North America. This was the Spanish who went across to present-day Florida. Now, remember, North America is inhabited already by groups of people, and these people are forced, and this process begins now, the forcing of the Native American, Native Indian communities into special areas called reservations. Now, there were originally 5 million people in these communities, and by 1900, there is only around 250,000. Okay, so it's so important we recognize the destruction of a traditional way of life, and how that is quite sad, and there's lots to be sorrowful about for that. Now, the first immigrants to America mainly come from countries such as Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany at this point. Okay, now the first successful English colony in North America happened in 1607 when the English settled in Jamestown. Now they begin to grow tobacco here. So tobacco is what we smoke in cigarettes, but at this time they smoke it in pipes. Now there are accounts of cannibalism from 1609 to 1610, and I thought you'd be interested in this. And we call this the starving time. Now, after the food ran out, because the colonists had been unable to grow enough food for the new season, and after this food ran out, the food they already had, some colonists, there's some evidence, it's very kind of tentative, but there is some evidence that colonists began to dig up corpses for food. And there was actually one man who was tortured and then burnt alive after he confessed to having killed and salted to eat his wife. Now, less interesting and more academic. When British people settled in America from the 1600s, they established those original 13 colonies along the East Coast. They were mostly farmers and grew crops like tobacco and cotton that could not be grown in British climates. From 1600, millions of African men, women, and children were taken to work as slaves on these huge cotton and tobacco plantations. By 1920, there were around 10 million African Americans, mostly living in southern states. Now, that's really important because we need to know the background, because we do come on to, in the 1950s and 60s, look at the civil rights movement. So it's important for us to know how African American communities were brought to America against their will, and how that all started. Okay, in 1620, we had the creation of Plymouth Colony near Cape Cod, which was founded by the Pilgrim Fathers, who were Puritans, which then was followed and inspired a movement of English Puritans who were leaving England and moving to New England to settle their own colony, so essentially escaping religious persecution. And if we move forward in time to 1775, we have the beginning of the American Revolution, led by George Washington, who leads the Continental Army against the British. This is primarily because people have started to view their identity as American rather than British. There were issues such as the no taxation without representation, wanting representation in Parliament, not wanting to pay the British taxes anymore, and Navigation Acts meant that America had absolutely no independence over the goods that were brought into America and totally relied on the British. So we see the beginning of the American Revolution. And in 1776, that very, very important declaration, the Declaration of Independence, endorsed by all of the colonies. Now, in 1781, we have that monumental moment, the Battle of Yorktown. I don't know about you, but every time I say that, I am reminded of Hamilton and the song, the Battle of Yorktown. Anyway, the British are defeated at the Battle of Yorktown, which effectively ends the American Revolution. It is the seminal moment for the American troops, the turning point of the war. Okay, and in 1787, the founding fathers of America draw up a new US Constitution, which comes into effect 1 year later in 1788. Now, a constitution is a set of rules which describe how the country should be governed. It's decided that in America, there are going to be two types of government: the central federal government based in Washington, D.C., the capital. This would oversee the whole country and matters that impacted the entire country, like the army, the postal service, foreign affairs. There would be local state governments that could make laws that impacted just that individual state. Okay, this is a really important distinction to make about America. It's very different to Britain in this sense. You have state government that can change that particular state, and you have federal government which kind of umbrellas everything. Okay, now there would be local state governments that could make laws for their own state, and it was going to be led, the federal government was going to be led by a president elected for every 4 years, a cabinet of advisors, and Congress, which was like a parliament made up of elected people from individual states. So just in the same way that in England, or in Britain, sorry, we have elections and we send people to parliament from the local boroughs or local areas, or constituencies as we call them, America does the same thing, but they send people from each state to go and sit in Congress, which is their version of Parliament. Now, this has led to some very bizarre laws in some states, so I thought I would just share a couple with you to spark up your day. So, in Kansas, it used to be illegal to serve wine in teacups. In Alabama, it used to be illegal to have an ice cream cone in your back pocket. It's also illegal to drive blindfolded. Hopefully that's the case everywhere. In Arizona, it's illegal for a donkey to sleep in a bathtub. In Louisiana, it's illegal to send a surprise pizza. So you can't, send a little surprise pizza to your friend or you'll get yourself landed in jail. In Maryland, sleeveless shirts are banned in public. So no vest tops or gym tops or anything in public, or you'll get yourself in trouble. And leading on from this idea of the new US Constitution being set up, we have the election of the very first president, which is George Washington in 1789. So, fun fact about George, he was one of the wealthiest presidents of all time, with assets worth more than $500 million. This is mainly due to large alcohol distilleries that he owned, and by 1799, he was producing 11,000 gallons of whiskey. Now, in 1808, the Atlantic slave trade is abolished. So the British Empire essentially bans the selling and buying of slaves. Now, this doesn't directly affect America. America have got their independence now, but it, I guess, is a worldwide signal that perhaps this practice should be coming to an end. obviously looking back, we completely agree with that. Now, by the end of the 19th century, indigenous people are crushed as new immigrant groups arrive from Europe and settlers move westwards. So think about America as a map. Remember that originally people settled on that east coast. Now people are starting to move westwards to find new land, to live on, to farm, and new opportunities, okay? And with that movement, we have the forcing of more and more suppression of those native groups that lived there originally. The number of states in America at this point increases from 17 to 45. Okay, so that we see a huge explosion of mass immigration and movement and migration across the country to establish new places to live. Now, around 1850, a new wave of immigrants starts to arrive in America. And these people come mainly from Eastern and Southern Europe, such as Russia, Poland, Italy, Hungary, and Greece. Now, the difference is originally we had people from Britain, Germany, and most of those people were quite well educated, had some money, and were going out to try and establish a new life. What we see from 1850 is the migration of people from backgrounds who are less well off and often not as well educated. Now, we also have Chinese, Japanese, Cuban, and Mexican immigrants also starting to arrive at this time. Now, this leads to a phrase which is used sometimes about America, about the diversity there is in terms of the people, the melting pot, that idea that lots of different people are in this country together. Now, this led to some resentment and some huge tensions actually from within America itself over a threat or a perceived threat to the way of life from the original immigrants towards the new immigrants. We'll look at this in a particular lesson later on, that resentment, but I just wanted to make you aware of it in this timeline. Now, another little fun fact, at this point, around 1 million people arrived from Ireland, as it kind of correlates with the Irish potato famine and lack of opportunities in Ireland and lots of opportunities in America. So we see a big migration of people from Ireland. Now, in 1854, just a little additional fact, the Republican Party is created, and this party in particular are pushing for the abolition of slavery. Now, in 1860, we have the election of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, as president. He, fun fact about him, he was originally a young wrestler and was defeated only once out of 300 matches. So very, very successful in his youth. Now, in 1860 as well, the Civil War in America is triggered when 11 pro-slavery states secede from the Union and form the Confederate States of America. So they split off. Now, these are mainly Southern states who benefit hugely from slavery and feel threatened to their way of life by this move and the election of the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, and this idea they're a bit concerned about that slavery might be abolished. So they separate this, they succeed themselves, right? And then in response to that, we have the triggering of civil war. So America is now at war with each other, the North versus the South. Okay. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves to be free. And in 1865, the Confederates were defeated and slavery was officially abolished under the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, okay? So a huge turning point in American history. However, unfortunately, there are many examples of slaves who did not even find out about either the proclamation or the amendment until much later, a couple of years. So it was not a kind of a fail-safe sudden click moment where everybody achieved their slavery. We also obviously have this continuation of people ignoring African Americans' civil and human rights, which is why we have the movement in the 1950s and 60s for civil rights. Okay, in 1917, America intervenes in World War I and arguably, significantly impacts the Allied cause. After the war, they reject membership to the League of Nations, despite the fact it was put forward by America itself. And in 1920, women are given the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, so the extension of the franchise, the extension of suffrage. Right, this is basically where the course begins. So I'm not going to go any further. I'm not going to ruin it. You need to stay tuned and watch the later videos to find out what happens from 1920 onwards. But what is really obvious, I think, from this timeline is that there are loads and loads of different people who moved to America. And that's why we call it the melting pot. By the 1900s, there were over 100 different nationalities living in America, some who came in search of a better life, others fleeing poverty or persecution. The population by 1920 is around 110 million, okay? And America is a hugely diverse, hugely interesting place to look. So please be excited about what's to come.